weary travellers, if you're lost in the mists of Bodmin Moor in the 1700s, you can always look for the warm sanctuary of the Jamaica Inn for some hearty food and a bed for the night. But be careful who you make eye contact with. And don't listen too closely to the hushed conversations of illegal brandy and tea being smuggled ashore that night, or your throat might meet with the business end of a dagger. It sounds like the start to a movie about swashbuckling pirates and highwaymen, right? It was the reality for the formative years of this isolated coaching inn. And while the threat of running into hardened criminals protecting their loot with their life may be long gone, some say that their souls, and those of their victims, very much remain at the Jamaica Inn to this day. So Bodmin Moor is an 80 square mile patch of moorland in Cornwall, and back in the early 18th century there weren't really any routes through it. If you wanted to get to Bodmin from like Launceston, you'd basically need to go the long way round and basically just go around the moor. Unless you fancied your chances on a track that was just about good for pack horses and nothing else. Especially not your nice coach and horses. By the mid-1700s though, a man called John Broad had made a handshake agreement with a guy called James Scarwin from Northampton. And they're not 100% sure, but this John Broad might have been a sea captain. So like retiring from the seafaring life and building a new one on land kind of thing. And in 1750, he'd built himself a little dwelling for him and his two sons to move into. So the original house was basically what you can still see between the two chimneys that stand in the building today. And they'd got a bit of livestock, stables, outbuildings and that sort of thing, and they were just carving out a life on the moor for themselves. And at this point in its history, it was the beginnings of what would become the Jamaica Inn, but at that point it was known as the New Inn, which is imaginative, I suppose. It was a new building, that makes sense. Basically just for the weary traveller that had decided to take the packhorse track and needed a place to stop over. In 1778 though, they'd built a turnpike, which is basically like a toll, and improved the road through the moor. More traffic could now move in and out of Cornwall, basically using this shortcut. And so it was prime time for the inn to undergo a bit of a renovation and get ready for this influx of extra travellers using the new road. So they'd built a new stable block, which would obviously like have more horses when people needed to swap them out for fresh horses. And they had also built cottages over the road too. It was also believed that there was a blacksmith there now too, and at least by 1860 we've got records of a John Cox who was a smithy there. And it was this 1778 renovation that also saw the name change to what it is today, the Jamaica Inn. And like all good stories, there are a few potential reasons behind the name change. The first one was that the Cornish coast especially was a haven for smugglers, which obviously plays a huge part in this story, so we're going to talk loads more about it a bit later, but just for now, one of the things that they would smuggle in and then hide in the building was rum from Jamaica. Another potential reason behind the inn's new name was a nod to one of the wealthy landowning families in the area at the time, the Trelawneys. And then the connection there was that a couple of the Trelawneys had actually served as governors in Jamaica. And one of them, Sir William Trelawney, he had not long died in Jamaica while he was governor in 1772, so only like 6 years earlier. But there was another story that came to light about the potential origin of the inn's name. So this place, it wasn't a place that the upper class would use to rest up before the next leg of their journey. It was rough and ready, and it was a safe place for smugglers. And thanks to the independence wars in America and conflicts with France and things like that, taxation was through the roof, which was making buying goods like alcohol and tea just too expensive. Buying tea in England was 6 times more expensive than buying it in Europe. And so that's why smuggling was such a lucrative income, because you brought smuggling goods that obviously weren't taxed, you'd save a bunch of money and be able to afford nice things again. And just to give you an idea of the scale of smuggling back then, it was actually estimated that if all of the goods that had been smuggled into Falmouth over 1 year had been imported properly, and so had the proper taxes charged on them, the money collected just on the tax of those smuggled goods would have been double the amount of land tax collected in the entire country. Double the amount! So it was a lot. And there was a lot coming in through the Cornish and Devon coasts. Someone estimated that half the brandy and a quarter of all the tea being smuggled in came through Cornwall and Devon. And that's the thing, like, it's just, we say ordinary everyday things, but it was nice but everyday things at that point. Like, we're not talking ridiculous amounts of opium. It was just things like tea, brandy, wine, tobacco, things like that. Things that normal people potentially would have been able to afford, but they were just completely priced out of the market on because of this tax. It's almost like a cost of living crisis with all of this high taxation. So the alternative story for where the inn got his name was that apparently someone had smuggled in strawberries and were hiding them in the inn ready to sell on. But the thing is, you look at strawberries funny and they start to go off, like 0 shelf life. And these strawberries were already past their best. So the innkeeper had boiled up the strawberries and put them into these big barrels to hide them and basically made shed loads of jam. So the name is actually the Jamaica Inn. Jamaica Inn. Which is just a cute story, isn't it? Oh, silly little smugglers. Oh, no. Some of these were really nasty people. Because there was money to be made, of course it was going to be cutthroat. Once, there was one of these smugglers and he was on his deathbed. He was an old man and he'd called for the local priest to come and give him his last rites. When the priest got to the dying man's bedside, the old man looked up at him and goes, "You don't remember me, do you?" The priest sort of goes, "No, my son, I'm sorry, I have lots of sheep in my flock," kind of thing. And the old smuggler goes, "Oh yeah, well, probably for the best anyway, because we did meet one night many years ago." The priest had been out for an evening stroll and had reached a crossroads. One way went to the coastal path, and then another just went inland. At the crossroads, standing there, was this smuggler. And the smuggler kind of goes like, "Oh, evening, father, you don't want to go down that coastal roadway. Go down the other way. It's a much nicer walk." The priest goes, "Oh, you know what? All right then. I'll go this other way. Thank you for the recommendation." And so this smuggler, on his deathbed, told the priest, "I'm so glad you listened to me and chose to go down the other way that night. Because if you hadn't, I would have been under orders to slit your throat." Because obviously the smuggler was working with a group that were getting a shipment that night, and of course there couldn't be any witnesses. And so that kind of gives you an idea of the clientele that would have frequented the Jamaica Inn. So much so that there was apparently a window on the first floor that would have had a candle in it. If the candle was lit, the coast was clear and smugglers were free to bring their contraband in to hide at the Jamaica Inn. There were also stories of other less than savoury characters using the Jamaica Inn too. Everything from cutthroats and highwaymen to even people called wreckers. And basically what wreckers would do is if there was a shipwreck that had washed up on the Cornish coast, they would just pick clean the wreckage, like take anything that was valuable. Even if there were sailors in the water screaming for help. Helping a sailor from the boat you're looting isn't exactly going to help you make more money from those illegal goods, is it? There were people who said that the wreckers used to light fake beacons on the shoreline so that the ships in the night would think it was safe, but actually would have just been deliberately ran aground or crash into rocks and the wreckers could then raid them. But in reality, there's no clear evidence that this was actually done. Plus, if there were reports getting out that people were actively trying to make ships crash, it would have drawn a lot more attention. The king's men would have been all over you, which wouldn't have been conducive to the whole secretive smuggling contraband into the country kind of thing. And so the Jamaica Inn, it had become such a haven for these criminals that it even inspired a book about the place, literally called The Jamaica Inn. It was written by Daphne du Maurier, who was a super popular author. She also wrote the books Rebecca and The Birds, and all 3 of those books were also turned into films directed by Alfred Hitchcock. So basically, Daphne got inspired by the place in 1930 when she was visiting with a friend. They'd taken some horses out to go riding, but they'd become lost on the moors. Like the fog had set in, it was starting to get dark, like this is how people die out here on Bodmin Moor. They decided, you know what, we have no clue what we're doing or where we're going. These horses live here. They probably have a better chance of finding their way back than we do. And so they let the horses lead them back to the Jamaica Inn, which they did, and the landlord was standing outside with a lantern to greet them. She stayed for a few days afterwards to kind of recover from that particularly stressful ordeal, and then came back the year after in 1931. It was during this visit that the Vicar of Altrincham just happened to be visiting at the same time and was having afternoon tea there. He'd began to tell her all about the stories of the smugglers and the wreckers and how the inn had been notorious back in its criminal heyday. And that got her author brain a-going, all these ideas for a story. So she wrote the book The Jamaica Inn about a woman called Mary who goes to live with her aunt and uncle at the Jamaica Inn. And the part I absolutely love is that the real Jamaica Inn actually leans into this. So spoiler for the story, but there is a murder that happens in the book. And if you visit the Jamaica Inn for yourself, you can see a plaque which marks the very spot where this fictional murder happened. Which is just pretty neat. But all the while Daphne is getting all of this inspiration about it being this seedy little criminal heaven, it seemed like the landlords of the time were trying to move away from that reputation. Because between about 1880 and 1950, the Jamaica Inn Hotel, as it was known at that time, was a temperance house, which meant that there was no alcohol served there. Because there was this thing called the temperance movement, which basically promoted this like teetotal lifestyle. You don't need alcohol to have a good time kind of thing. But in 1950, it was clear that alcohol wasn't going anywhere. Prohibition in America had already been completely repealed almost 20 years ago by that point, so they started serving alcohol again after trying 4 times to get a license. I can imagine it would have been pretty difficult for a temperance house to get a license. Like, it's been alcohol free for so long, and then now they want to go back to serving alcohol. I'm guessing that was the reason. Either way, it went back to being a place where people could stop over, have a drink, some good food, and a bed for the night. And to this day, it is still as popular as ever. It's been added to and expanded over the years. They had an extension in 2017 to add some new hotel rooms. And so if you visit now, like, there's actually quite a lot to do, which, I mean, like, fair play to them, like making it a destination where people will travel to. So they've got 36 hotel rooms, obviously the pub itself serving drinks and food. There's a farm shop there as well, and they've also turned the stable block into a museum where you can learn about Daphne du Maurier, because obviously fans of the book will want to travel to the actual Jamaica Inn and experience the book in real life kind of thing. But then they've also got a smuggling museum, which has loads of artifacts and an educational film about the part that the Jamaica Inn played in being kind of like the place to hide and sort through your contraband before sending it on up into the rest of the country. So you've got all that to look forward to when you go to visit. But you've also got something else there, the ghost stories. And there are so many ghost stories. And there's so much interest in these ghost stories as well that the Jamaica Inn has its kind of like own official paranormal team that will host investigation nights, let other teams come and investigate and things like that, but also do their own experiments and things. And what I really love is that they are really interested in the history too. Like, yeah, they try and communicate with whatever is still there, but then they'll go and research local records and see if they can match up any of the information. And these alleged hauntings at the Jamaica Inn have been going on for well over 100 years too. The first encounter with something potentially paranormal came in 1911, and the story was actually apparently printed in Country Life magazine, which I would have loved to have seen the article on that, but I couldn't find anything online. And the story goes that there was a man wearing old-fashioned clothes sitting on the front wall outside of the inn. Several of the locals had obviously noticed him, obviously sticking out a bit in his strange clothes, and they tried to talk to him but got nothing back. Didn't even acknowledge them. And then, right in front of their eyes, he just faded away. He's also been seen in the years since. One of the resident investigators, Karin, she interviewed a woman who was in the back of her parents' car in 1977, and they were just driving past the inn. She said that she'd seen this guy, again, sitting on the wall in those old-fashioned clothes. Like, it's gonna stick out that he clearly doesn't belong there. Apparently, she'd asked her parents who that man was sitting on the wall, but when her parents looked, the man had already disappeared. And she was young at the time, and they were only driving past. Like, she had no idea of the history or the stories associated with the inn, which just makes it that little bit more compelling, doesn't it? This figure dressed in his old-fashioned outfit is thought to be the same one that's in the original bar too. He's been seen leaning up against the fireplace and also sitting at a table which is now known as Jack's table. I don't think they really know his name, but they just call him Jack. Again, it seems like he won't really acknowledge you, although one woman once claimed that she had seen him, and he was sitting at his table with his head resting on one hand, and he was kind of looking at her curiously. But the legend behind this figure is that he was a stranger drinking in the bar one night. He wasn't a local, he might have been like a traveller passing through, some think he might have been a sailor. Either way, we don't really know. He was halfway through finishing his drink when he was called outside by someone. Kind of just like, oh, nip outside with me for a second, mate, just need to have a word. He left his half-full tankard on the bar and went outside, and he was never seen alive again. Some stories say that his body was found on the moors in the morning, others say that his body was never recovered, but that's the story that's sort of associated with this entity. There's even been apparently some poltergeist activity captured on camera in the main bar. The landline phone was just unhooked from the receiver and just dropped to the floor. And you can clearly see on camera, there's no one other than that one person behind the bar. She's nowhere near the phone. Like, it's very weird. Apparently the paranormal team were like desperately trying to debunk this after the fact, like jumping up and down around the phone, seeing if it was like vibrations from the floor or something, but it wasn't budging. Like, these things are designed to, you know, like actually stay on the receiver. Apparently the wall that it's attached to is 4 foot thick as well, so you can't just bang on the other side of the wall and it'll fall off. It's just very strange. There've also been the sounds of hushed conversations heard throughout the inn, and you won't be able to make out what they're saying, not because they're too quiet or anything, but because the conversations are in a different language, and some think it's possibly Old Cornish. And as you would expect in a haunted pub, glasses are often seen flying off the bar and smashing, and there's apparently sometimes been the smell of tobacco smoke. And so obviously this smell of tobacco smoke, like, it wouldn't have been any of the living, as obviously smoking in pubs and stuff was banned in like 2007. Could it have been that it's like seeped into the walls or like the old furniture? Maybe. but then again, maybe not. There's also apparently been the figure of a US World War II airman spotted walking into the bar before vanishing. Which seems like a weird detail, like why would a World War II airman be there? But the thing was that there were thousands of American troops stationed in the area during the Second World War. So they would have let their hair down at all of these kind of pubs in the area. But interesting that one came back to haunt the Jamaica Inn. Like from what I could see, there was no records or stories or anything of any airmen dying at the inn. The hotel rooms though, that seems to be where a lot of the activity happens. Which, I mean, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Like, yeah, all of the conversations about smuggling and dodgy dealings would take place over a tankard of ale in the bar. But the privacy of your own lodging room, that's where real life's gonna happen, isn't it? Is this gonna make a terrible video? Or are people gonna love it because you're in here now? So rooms 3, 4, 5 and 6 are kind of like the most popular. I think they would have probably been the original rooms maybe. So room 3, there have been a few guests claim that they'll be asleep in bed and then they'll wake up to see the figure of a young boy, like probably around 10 years old, standing at the foot of the bed, watching you. You can also sometimes hear scratching coming from within the walls, which is just absolutely terrifying. A lot of women have also reported just feeling like completely overcome with emotion. Like the emotional pain hurts so bad, like they've just lost a family member, just floods of tears, inconsolable. Turns out there have been reports of a Victorian woman seen carrying a baby, and she'll like walk through the walls of room 5, through room 4 and into room 3. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I stop? I do apologise. And it's thought that this baby was either stillborn or had died just after being born, and that's the emotion that these women are being affected with. There have also been sounds of a baby crying being heard, particularly in room 3 and room 7. So you'll just think, there must be a baby staying at the inn, right? So you'll go down in the morning, ask the staff, and of course they'll say there are no babies staying in the inn right now. The paranormal team at the inn think that maybe this baby crying is linked to the story of Mary Downing and her son. And basically, Mary Downing, she was this young, unmarried woman who fell pregnant by the landlord at the time, Thomas Dunn. He was married. Obviously, he wanted nothing to do with the kid, but she sued him to basically force him to recognise this illegitimate child. And this is what I mean about the Jamaica Inn paranormal team, like, doing the work. Karin, one of the investigators, actually found the record of this kid being baptised at Alton Church, and the baby was christened Thomas Downing Dunn. Like, tying this whole story into an actual historical record, which is the kind of work we love over here. But it's interesting then that they link this baby crying to the story. What? Are you gonna bite me? As I couldn't really find any information about what happened after. Like, why are they still there? When Most Haunted visited in 2004, Derek Acora claimed that the innkeeper had actually murdered them both, because obviously they were a stain on his reputation and they needed to disappear. But he's the only one that seems to make this claim, so yeah. And I don't know if he's getting things mixed up, he's looking at the wrong Wikipedia page or whatever, but there does seem to be another ghostly mother and child, I think. And they seem to be centered around what looks to be kind of the most haunted room, I would say. And people have seen a figure of a woman and her daughter walking through the wall into room 5. The story here is that they stayed in the Jamaica Inn the night before boarding a ship in Falmouth, but the boat sank and they both died, so now they appear to have returned to the place that they spent their last night. So now if you look in the wardrobe of room 5, don't be alarmed to see like loads of toys and letters to a girl called Hannah, because that's apparently the name of the daughter that died in the shipwreck. She also seems to make her presence known like on her own, away from her mom. One guest once saw wet footprints on the carpet leading towards the wardrobe, which is kind of where the bathroom would have been. And other guests have claimed to have been woken up by the feeling of their legs being touched by icy hands. There was even one serviceman who was staying the night in room 5 and he bailed halfway through and went to sleep in his car. He was affected like that badly by something in there. Room 4 has its own stories tied to it too, with muffled voices being heard, as well as like super heavy footsteps, like someone wearing boots is circling in your room. There's also been a huge, great big shadowy figure of what looks like a highwayman spotted in this room. He'll be wearing one of those tricorn hats with a big dark green cloak on. And there was one night where a husband and wife, who were both solicitors, were staying in room 4. They both woke up to see this huge, ominous figure standing at the end of their bed. terrifying. But it didn't seem to put them off too much, as they were booked to stay another night. And this second night, they were woken up again. This time to sounds coming from outside. Because you could be mistaken for thinking that they'd been transported back to the 1700s and there was like horses and coaches outside, and that maybe some smugglers were dropping off their latest shipment. They said that you could hear horses' hooves and whinnies and the sound of metal coach wheels, but that it sounded like it was on gravel, which if you look at the outside of the inn, it's been cobbled since the 1950s. But back in the day, it was actually gravel outside, which is a very interesting detail. According to Peter Underwood too, in his book Ghosts of Cornwall, a figure of a man on a horse has also been seen outside the pub. And it's not just the old parts that have got all of these ghost stories. Even over in the new block, guests have experienced weird things. Because yeah, it's called the new block, but technically it follows the lines of the old barn. So it's kind of still just a rebuilt part of the old inn. One guest that was staying in room 23, obviously in the new block, they'd got checked in, they'd dumped all their stuff in the room and gone to dinner. When they'd come back to the room, they were kind of horrified. It looked like housekeeping had just gone in and trashed all of their stuff. It was everywhere. All of their luggage was just out. It was all messed up. So obviously they were pretty mad. So they went back downstairs kind of like, what the hell? The staff were like, of course no one's been in your room. Like, you've only just got here. She ended the conversation there though. Like, the staff was saying it wasn't them, but it must have been. Like, there's no other explanation, right? Later that night, that same guest was woken up in the middle of the night to see a woman wearing a Victorian dress standing in the bedroom. The guest was like, oh, so you're housekeeping. You're the one that messed up all my stuff. I love that in the middle of the night, she's still just thinking this must be housekeeping. She soon quickly realised that it most definitely was not housekeeping, as the Victorian woman turned and walked into the bathroom and never came back out. People staying in the new block also commonly report someone knocking on their door, but then when they go to answer it, there's no one there. And it just kind of seems that like it doesn't matter where you stay in the Jamaica Inn, you've got just as much of a chance of having your own run-in with something paranormal. Even the actual housekeepers at this point, like, they have to laugh about it. Is it because if they didn't they would cry? I don't know. Basically, they're usually about in the morning and sometimes they will see the paranormal team. And it's got to the point where now if they see that the paranormal team's been about, they'll start being all like, oh great, you're around. Now they're all going to be playing up in the rooms now. Kind of alluding to the fact that when a paranormal investigation is going on, calling out to whatever is still there at the inn, it kicks up some energy. And for the housekeepers, it sometimes means more work. Because they'll go in to clean one of the rooms and they'll be like, I don't know, like wiping down mirrors, go off to make beds. And by the time they come back, there's loads of little tiny handprints all over the mirrors. And this is the thing, like, kids seem to be a really common thing at the Jamaica Inn. There's apparently been a Victorian girl with long blonde curly hair called Elizabeth spotted in the museum, which is the old stable block. And she's also been seen in the corridor between the gift shop and the women's toilets. And she's said to be quite playful, like she can be heard giggling in the shop itself. And there's also a stable boy called David spotted in the museum, as well as a dog that's reported to be as big as a Labrador, but with a wiry coat of a wolfhound, which would have been about the standard for hunting dogs in Cornwall during the Victorian times. But it's really not all children giggling at sunshine and rainbows, especially not in what used to be the old stable block. A lot of staff members refuse to go into the museum alone. There seems to be a lot of talk about one particular entity that makes his presence known in a few different ways. It's thought that he was a blacksmith, so could potentially be John Cox, who shows up on the census between 1861 and 1881. In 2018, one of the paranormal team, Colin, was leading an investigation when just out of nowhere, his whole body felt like it was on fire. Like white hot, that prickly heat, like he was completely burning up. Almost like he'd just been thrown in, I don't know, like a blacksmith's forge or something. He got outside of the museum and he was completely fine. There's also been a huge shadowy figure of a man seen multiple times, usually over by the fire exit of the museum. And if you're standing over there and this figure appears, it will just feel like it's way darker. Like you just have the feeling that there is someone standing right in front of you and all you can see is just this darkness. And it feels like this figure is like right up in your face. Like super intimidating, just trying to get into your grill and make you leave. One woman had this experience. She'd moved into that area near the fire exit and seemed to have this figure, again, all up in her space. And so she reached out to what she just assumed was another member of the group, seeing if like they could move away a little bit. Only her hand went straight through. So yeah, she was pretty hysterical after that, understandably. And just to top off just how unfriendly this entity is, apparently 2 women reported the feeling of someone putting their hand up their skirts. Classy. But it seems like it's been this way for years. A woman that was born there in the 1950s said that her mother had commented on living at the Jamaica Inn. She'd said that her mom was totally fine during the day, it's pleasant enough, but then at night, once it's all quiet and dark, she hated living there. And so while the days of pirates, wreckers and smugglers seem to be centuries behind us, maybe there are still souls that remain at the Jamaica Inn, living out their lives and perhaps deaths, unaware of the 21st century around them. But what do you think? Is the Jamaica Inn as haunted as it's claimed to be? Have you ever visited or experienced something a little bit weird? It's a really interesting one for me because I do think that it is haunted. I think that footage of the phone coming off the hook, like that is super weird. And for so many people to have claimed different things, sometimes years apart, with absolutely no prior knowledge of the place, it just seems like there's definitely something to it. But then, this is just my grain of salt, my healthy dose of skepticism, is always when a place is directly profiting off of the paranormal stories surrounding it, which I know can apply to a lot of the places that I talk about, but especially when they have like a dedicated paranormal department, basically. Like Colin and Karin, they kind of work as official investigators of the place, like they host investigations, do their own and all of that. And so then, of course, it's going to be good for business when people have these experiences. They're going to go and tell their friends who also want a paranormal experience, who are going to come geared up and buy their ticket, ready to see a ghost. But then again, is that also how so many stories share these things in common because people are influenced by the stories? And then they take something that had a normal explanation and just run with it that they just had a paranormal experience? I think a lot of these conclusions that I try and make, like, you can go either way. Like, most of the time, it will just come down to how much of a believer or a skeptic you are. Which is just the fun part though, isn't it? Like, how people's own beliefs, like, play into what they perceive about the world around them. But that's getting a little bit too existential here. So bottom line is, I do believe it is haunted. Mostly by residual energies, I guess, but there may be some intelligence going on there, especially in the museum that seems to be the old stable block. And then with the history itself, like it's a very old building. It's got centuries of history. And absolutely hats off to the team there who are trying to find all of these historical records and evidence that tie these stories together. Obviously, you're never going to nail everything. Like we're talking about smuggling in the 1700s. These sort of criminals aren't one for keeping diaries, you know? But I'm still 100% expecting that there is going to be some misinformation in there. Like with that story of that Jack stranger. Like there were versions of the story where his body was never recovered and then others where it was found in the morning. Like, which one was it? But it's highly likely that we will never know the full details. Either way, that was the story of the history and hauntings of the Jamaica Inn in Cornwall. I will absolutely be adding this as another one on my list of places to visit. I would absolutely love to experience what it's like for myself though. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Here he comes, back again. I'm not letting you back out yet. What are we gonna do now? Okay, he absolutely had to come into the room right now.